Dr. Shola, what a massive honor. Hello, 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 hello,
Hello, hello, hello.
hello, hello, hello. Um, Blimey, wow, this is a very, very important book that you just written, which is called "This Is Why I Resist." It could not be more timely. It was always going to be timely, but it's so timely. I just want to kick off. I mean, firstly, well done doing a book during lockdown, which I've gone through. Is its own.
You know how it feels. You know it. You know the pain.
So let's kick off. Why was it so important to write this book now?
Okay, so this book has been in the works of my mind for a good couple of years. 2020 for me just brought all the elements together for me to sit down and write it already because it is very obvious that the conversations we have around race, racism, and race inclusion has not improved for a century or more, right? It seems like, in spite of what those before us have done and have sacrificed in terms of liberty, in terms of their lives, has not made the kind of paradigm shift that will ensure the eradication of racial inequality and racial injustice. So, for me, particularly as a Black anti racist activist, writing about systemic racism was important because we need to understand that today the issue is no longer what racism is, but how it manifests in people's understanding, particularly white people. Again, this doesn't mean all white people are racist. For God's sake, I'm so tired of having to explain that. It just means that the systemic discriminations, long-standing structural inequalities exist as a result of the legacy of slavery, colonialism, and the continuing existence of white supremacy. And what this book does is to blow the lid off indefensible rhetoric, on race, on racism. It basically is the hard conversation that we have to have. And this book disabuses readers of any notion that talking about racism and race inclusion has to be comfortable. How in God's name is it meant to be comfortable when racism itself is not comfortable? So this book literally goes step by step using contemporary examples. I draw from ongoing conversations on social media, from mainstream headlines, from civil protests, from the kind of policies and decisions that are being made by our politicians to show and exemplify the ongoing systemic discrimination and how that manifests, particularly how racism manifests in the understanding, as I said earlier, of white people. I can already hear people going, well, why? How can you possibly know what white people think? Because I read what they say and what they're writing. I watch what they say and what they're writing. And again, that's not all white people. It's just those who continue to push this denial that systemic racism is an issue, or those who are just willfully ignorant.
I mean, you say that this book is not just speaking to Black people and ethnic minorities; it's speaking to white people. I'm interested in what you mean by that, and also why is it and you can see this whether it be when someone writes about racism for a newspaper or goes on TV, a person of color talks about it. And some white people behave as though you've gone up to their mother and said something extremely insulting. Like it's this visceral rage. What is that all about? So what do you mean by that when you say it's that for white people? But also what is that response telling us?
They're triggered, Owen, and there's a reason they're triggered, right? If my words can have such powerful response that they want to deny it or accuse me of being racist or anti-white like some of them do, it just tells me what camp they're in. They're in a camp of those who want to continue white supremacy. They're in a camp of those who have this irrational fear of racial diversity. They're in the camp of those whose way of life is predicated on the denial of an equal value of life and liberty for Black people and ethnic minorities. So that says a whole lot about them. Now, the reason why I am ready to get into a boxing ring is because this thing is real. The pain, the dehumanization of the Black identity is real. The way it impacts from children to grown-ups is real. That children are experiencing discrimination in schools because of the color of their skin, whether it's because of their head, head discrimination, that they get either expelled or suspended from school, on to the kind of workplace discrimination that still goes on. That is all rooted in white supremacy. Somebody needs to talk about it, and there have been people who've been talking about it before I came on the scene. And I have no doubt that there are going to be people after me who come and talk about it as well, which is why one of the powerful questions I ask in my book is, when will white people progress, right? People like to think, this is a kumbaya moment, that when will black people overcome? No. I'm done with that, because that question was decades ago, before I was born. Right now, we should be asking our white siblings, when are you going to progress? And saying this, and I say this in the book, that people need to understand that we have had white allies from the get-go, some of whom have actually lost their life and liberty fighting for racial equality and racial justice. The problem was they were lone voices in a system that profited over the dehumanization of black people. And people want to go, well, you were never a slave, so how can you talk about slavery? I'm like, please, if we are still experiencing the negative stereotypes, the kind of the false equivalence that comes from using our oppression to complain and say that white people are feeling the same, if we're still experiencing the lack of equal opportunities that result in equal outcomes, it means nothing. Jack all has changed. That is why it is important to have this conversation, to eradicate white supremacy, right? So when you say, what do I mean by that? I'm saying the system needs to be broken. This system, this mindset that that a white skin is superior to a darker skin. We need to eradicate that nonsense. It's such an inferiority complex. There's nothing superior about being white. There's nothing inferior about being black or brown. And it's so ridiculous. We know, or when you and I know, that there's only one race. It's the human race, correct? Mm-hmm. But then those who thought that, well, they have to be smarter, decided to create a social construct in which the color of your skin dictates whether or not you're superior and inferior. That is what we're working. You were born into it. I was born into it, right? That is what we're still dealing with today. And you still see examples of this with leadership in government. How people can say this doesn't happen is just beyond me. So I am saying, since we're dealing with this social construct of race, then people really need to understand what racism is. So people want to go on about, as a white person, a black person has been racist to me. I'm like, you don't know what you're talking about. Black people and ethnic minorities are not racist to white people. That's not racism. That sure as heck is not systemic. There is no power construct that allows black people and ethnic minorities to deny a single white person, liberty and equal value of life and liberty. It doesn't work that way. We don't live in an alternate universe of nuts and crosses. It doesn't work that way. Does that mean that white people don't experience prejudice and bias? Of course they do, but not racism. Does this mean that they don't experience other forms of, whether it's class discrimination? Of course they do, but not racism. I also use the book to address the fact that we need to stop using the word racism as a catch-all phrase. It's not a catch-all phrase. There are expressions of hate out there, and we should give each one of them their own. We should give them the same level of advocacy, the same level of activism to end that expression of hate, whether it's Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, racism, all of it. We should identify them, because what people are not doing, Owen, is understanding how all of these inequalities intersect. And it's important to understand how they intersect so that you can give those who are truly experiencing the intersecting inequality the justice they deserve.
That's such a critical point you made, that there's this trope often in response to the struggle of black people for equality and against racism of, well, you talk about white privilege, but look how many millions of white people in Britain live in poverty. But the point is, they're not oppressed because of the color of their skin. It's class, and that's used. That's used, isn't it, as this somehow.
Thank you. And Owen, God give me strength. And they wonder why, when they bring such ignorance to say someone like me that I have zero patience for it. Because I'm like, hold up a second, unless you were born yesterday, how can you not possibly understand the difference? And if you don't understand the difference, how can you be so arrogant in your ignorance to want to defend it by suggesting they're the same thing? It's just this continual false equivalence. I want people to be able to have conversations where they go, you know what? I don't know that much, but or this is what I think. Let's have the conversation. I think anybody who picks up my book, I want them to feel like they're having a conversation with me. And I think it's important for people to understand that you can have these hard conversations. Yes, they can get heated. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have them. But to be actively anti-racist means to be ready to evolve, to be ready to understand what that looks like, whether you're black, white, and brown. And I also explain in the book that even as black and ethnic minority people, we all don't experience the same level of racism. We all don't. There's going to be some form of racism that I'm never going to experience, right? I've never experienced police brutality. Does that mean I should keep stum about police brutality? Hell no. Does it mean that I should not care about other forms of discrimination because I have not personally experienced it? No. So the same level of advocacy and activism that I bring against any form of inequality, racial or otherwise, it's the same that I will use to fight anti-Semitism, to fight Islamophobia, to fight any kind of phobia that actually denies people an equal value of life and liberty. Because that is what triggers me. Mm-hmm. Inequality triggers me. Injustice of any kind triggers me. That will get me into that boxing ring and I'm like, bring it on, because this has to end.
When George Floyd was killed by the US police and protests exploded across the United States, but not just there, also across the world, including here in Britain, the response of some right-wing commentators and politicians was to say, this is importing a US issue into British politics. What would you say to that?
Well, my book answers that because I disabuse them of all that nonsense. I give clear examples, and I give clear examples about how systemic racism in America and the United Kingdom is absolutely the same. There is no difference. And I remind people of the different examples of the different protests that we've held here and why, the different incidences of police brutality here. People think that because in the States they've got guns, it means, well, it's not real police brutality here. Are you out of your godforsaken mind? That's what I would say to them. Do you think that hands have not been used, chokeholds? Do you think sticks have not been used? People have not been kicked to death? Well, read my book and find out. The bottom line is this: both the United States and the United Kingdom are very strong, really strongly rooted in the legacy of slavery, in the dehumanization of the Black identity to enforce this white supremacist mindset. So when you hear politicians like the Boris Johnsons of this world and the Donald Trumps of this world spout out their utter nonsense about thugs and wanting to create excuses by saying, well, this is a US matter, you should know right there and then that these are people who do not have the interests of the Black community at heart. These are people who want to enforce the status quo. After all, as much as, we can talk about how well Winston Churchill stood up to Hitler, Winston Churchill is the same person that talked about the higher grade of white people. Think about that, right? And please don't give me the, it was a product of his time, because I swear to God, not you, Owen, I mean whoever it's because I'm so sick of that nonsense.
Throughout history, claims for justice by women, by LGBTQ people, and by Black people have been met by a kind of general response of, you're going about this the wrong way, that you need to be less forceful and more polite and not engage in various forms of struggle which will frighten people. What do you say to that?
I think they should take that mindset and shove it where the sun doesn't shine, because that's nonsense. And the reason they say that is because they don't want anything to change. The reason they say that is because their way of life is predicated on the denial of an equal value of life and liberty to Black people and ethnic minorities. It needs to stop. And you see, the interesting thing here, Owen, is you and I know that those who came before us met the same resistance. Martin Luther King talks about it. He talks about the white moderates, who he says are even worse are just as bad as those who are actually the KKKs. That when you tell us to wait your turn, think about it. It's like justice delayed is justice denied. So no, there is no turn to wait. It is time. It has to be now. It is affecting children. It is affecting people's opportunities. How can we not care about that? How can that not matter? That is what I'm talking about. And if people want to then put us into a box, I mean, look at the changes that happened because of the resistance from the LGBTQI community. And the fact that it's still ongoing, especially when you think about transphobia, right? I find it astonishing that we so claim to be such a progressive society, but the mindset of people is very much rooted in hate and bigotry against what they fear, what they what they don't understand. And this whole thing of, well, we have to be tolerant of other people. No, 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 no. I don't need you to tolerate me. I don't need your tolerance. Simply accept me as I am. And in my book, I talk about the impact on trans women, particularly Black trans women, and the intersecting inequalities that they experience. In fact, I talk about my conversation with my daughter, my 14-year-old daughter, who is very passionate about trans rights. She basically explained so much things, a lot of things to me, even taught me the meaning of certain acronyms. I say I'm getting old, so there's certain things that come to me that are new. I'm like, so what is that again? Mommy, it's this. And she's very passionate about the ongoing Turk war between Turks, which she explained to me, and trans women. And especially this whole this conversation around the restroom. Even when she was talking to me about it, she was livid. She said, are you trying to tell me that we should prioritize the feelings of cis women over the lives of trans women? You want them to go to restrooms of men where they will most definitely be in danger. Why would you want that? Why would anybody want that? In fact, my daughter explained, she said, are you telling me, mommy, that trans women will go through all of the changes they go through, all of the experiences that they'll go through, so as to attack cis women? How does that make sense? Read it and find out. I mean, I'm learning so much from her as well. And that's the next generation. That is why it is so important for us to fight inequality and injustice in any form, manner that it shows up, because it is unacceptable. 2021 has to be the year of action.
It's interesting bringing that up because there's often this discussion about so-called white feminism, which is not inclusive of trans people, as you talk about. And there's something this is something that comes up on my channel quite a lot, something specifically British about that, in the sense American mainstream feminism, you don't have that rampant transphobia that we have here. There's still transphobia in the US, of course, but it's more seen as that's a right-wing phenomenon. But as well as that, as being exclusionary towards Black women, for example, and working class women, it's seen as this very middle class white form of feminism. What do you think about that?
I think it's such a disgrace. We talk about feminism, and for me, feminism is something where we must celebrate every single day. Feminism should be about accepting women just as we are, because we are all different parts of one body. But yet, in apparently fighting the patriarchy, we bring the prejudices, the biases, and all of the kind of oppressive thinking from the patriarchy into the very movement that should be protecting women. It is unacceptable. Now, I've had, and I talk about this in the book, I talk about the fact that, feminists like to talk about, oh, we're so intersectional. We're so intersectional. I'm like, how are you intersectional, right? Feminism also white. How are you so intersectional? Feminism not so trans. And even feminism, well, not Muslim women. How are you intersectional? You don't know what the heck you're talking about. Because if you reject me because of my Afro-visible feminism, you cannot possibly call yourself a feminist. If you're going to reject a sex worker as a feminist because you don't like a profession, you are not a feminist. Let's just understand this. We are all different parts of the same body. And being a feminist, especially with wanting equal opportunities and equal outcomes to men, must be that we as women should be allowed to make whatever the heck choices we want, good and bad, poor and rich, whatever it is our right. That's the whole point. But when we start to divide and conquer within the very movement. That is so unacceptable. Now, I've had the opportunity and the blessing to work with some incredible white feminists, black feminists, and brown feminists. But I've also had the misfortune to work with some white feminists who bring that same mindset, who actually think, well, what we want to do is create spaces here for black women. This is what we want to do. I'm like, you cannot possibly create a space for me. That space was always mine. So you better step away if you want your peace and quiet. But don't try to claim and take credit for black women, for Muslim women, for trans women, as though you're doing them a favor and bringing that same white supremacist mindset into the feminist movement. In fact, I analyzed this in the book, and I use examples from the history of some white women. Remember, we're talking about some, not all. Some white women, and how that legacy of slavery has also played a part in how some white women treat black women. And it's important to understand that, and I explain that in the book as well.
What does the treatment of Meghan Markle by the media tell us?
Okay, so that the United Kingdom is systemically racist, institutionally so, and the continual denial of it is the same. What it tells us is this. There's so many layers and nuances to this, especially with the way the public responded. When you look at the responses from different sectors of the public, you see how disarrayed it is, right? That just tells you exactly where we are. And when it comes to racism and race inclusion. But the media in particular, sections of the media, the loudest part of the media, sought to profit over Meghan Markle, sought to profit over divisive rhetoric and narrative targeted against her, because they saw her, or they see her, as a money-making machine. This is part of the dehumanization of black pain. It's also, part of the ongoing conversation we're having about colorism, because some people will go, well, she's not that black, and I wouldn't have known if she was black. People seem to want to forget how insidious racism is, that people who are light-skinned of biracial black heritage also experience racism because of their biracial black heritage. It's all steeped in there. But the media definitely, I would say, they caused unnecessary outrage over every single thing about Meghan, in comparison to Catherine, for instance. I have no issue with Catherine per se, but they definitely tried to create drama between both of them. They tried to create stories that are not necessarily true, or maybe, and that is the point. They sought to profit.
Last year, you went viral. You were on ITV's This Morning, and this clip, which you spoke beautifully, that's why it went viral, and eloquently and passionately, got over 52,000 retweets, over 133,000 likes, and has been watched by 7.3 million people on Twitter alone. And in that, you said, and you were talking about the Meghan Markle, the treatment of Meghan Markle. And you said it's not the job of black people and ethnic minorities to educate white people on racism perpetuated by white people. White folks need to educate themselves on racism. So there'll be white people watching this. What's that kind of message to them? What do they need to step up and be proper allies?
I think it's important to understand that allyship is absolutely key. Now, but not just allyship, and this is one of the points that I talk about in the book. I need white folks watching, white siblings watching. I need you to understand that racism is your problem. It's not my problem. It is also your problem to fix. Because if you think that it is sustainable, the ongoing racial injustice and inequality is sustainable, you have a case to answer. If you think white supremacy is not an issue, you have a case to answer. This is your problem. You have to be ready to deal with it. That is what I would say being actively anti-racist means. It also means you being ready to evolve in your thinking, you being ready to clear any cobwebs you have, in your head, things that you don't understand. Have conversations with people that you feel safe with, people who know you, who are not going to necessarily judge you. Read on things, and if you don't like reading, watch stuff, right? I mean, I think there's so much powerful information out there, whether it's on YouTube or even documentaries that will help to enlighten you on a number of things. But when I said that it is not the job of Black people to educate white people on racism perpetrated by white people, it's because I am tired. You can't be asking me in the 21st century to explain to you what your parents should have explained to you. You can't be asking me to be explained to you in the 21st century what you should have been taught in schools. You can't be asking me to explain to you what you've been oblivious about, because it's been happening all around you and you've done nothing. But I'm happy to have a conversation only once you've done your education, because you see, when God was dishing out patience, I wasn't on that queue. So the bottom line is this: there is a responsibility, an individual one, and I want our white siblings to take on that individual responsibility, because it is not the responsibility of Black people and ethnic minorities to unpick your learning, to have a cup of tea with you and make you feel comfortable and well rested, that, okay, right, I'm ready for this now. I don't have time for that. I need you to be ready to come and fight, because this is something you must be ready to fight to win. You want to win justice. You want to win equality. You want to use your skill set. You want to use your privilege, right? You want to use everything that you are to be able to stand for the right thing. And when we talk about privilege, yes, I do deconstruct what white privilege is in the book. But let me use this opportunity to also say that we know that society has a default setting. That default setting is white, male, right? So, and stale. So male, pale, and stale, right? It is Christian, it is able-bodied, and a lot of other things. I need you to understand where you stand. So I know that as an able-bodied person, I have a privilege that my that siblings, people who experience disability don't have. It is my job to use that privilege as an able-bodied person in society to ensure they have equal value of life and liberty. I know that as a heterosexual, heterosexuality is the default in society. So I have a privilege as a heterosexual to ensure that my brothers and sisters and non-binary in the LGBTQI community have an equal value of life and liberty. You need to understand what value you bring. It's not about what you don't have. Okay, it's not about saying, well, I'm suffering too because I'm poor or I'm working class. So it's not that. Where you do have privilege, utilize it. That's what I'm saying. So when it comes to race, racism, and race inclusion, white privilege is a power you can use. You can weaponize for good rather than the way it's been used from time immemorial.
Finally, in 2021, what's your biggest fear in terms of the struggle against racism and white supremacy? But also, so we end on a hopeful note, what gives you the most hope and cause for optimism?
Okay, so I mean, in terms of fear, I wouldn't use the word fear. I would say, what are the challenges that I see?
Yeah, sure.
I think the challenge is definitely is just this ongoing fatigue, where, for instance, structures that have the power, like media, for instance, or government, decide, well, Black Lives Matter is not trending right now, so we can ignore the ethos of Black Lives Matter. The challenge of people being fatigued. So fatigue, not just with white people who kind of experience it all the time, but also fatigue from those who have been silenced for so long, those who continue to experience it, and because of their experience, they now feel silenced. I don't want that for them. I want to see real change, because the ethos of Black Lives Matter means that Black people are in it 365 days, 24/7. It's not a hotel you can check in and check out of. So if you're truly for equality, if you're truly for justice and looking to be actively anti-racist, you have to be in this hotel ready, not just in solidarity, but understanding that this is your problem to deal with too. In terms of hope, now I'm a hopeful person, right? I have to say that the youth give me a lot of hope. I loved the sight of so many youths, right, using the opportunity of Black Lives Matter to educate their parents. I don't know if you saw some of the TikTok videos or some of those that were shared online, where some white kids were telling their parents off for their views, for their mindsets, where we saw youths from different backgrounds, different races, social construct of race, right? And all of that, different faiths come together to fight, to say, we stand in solidarity in saying Black Lives Matter. That gives me hope, right? And I'm hoping that we learn from all of the things that have happened with Boris Johnson, with Donald Trump, and we do better with electing leaders that actually espouse the kind of values we want to see all around. That is important to me. So let me end with this. I need people to understand, and can't remember if I've said it earlier because I'm getting old. There's only one human race. Just one. Only one race. And you know it's human, the human race. That means the word race itself is a moot point. We don't need it. But because of this social construct of race, it has created such damage and such imbalance, not just within nations, between white and Black and ethnic minorities, but between white nations and Black and brown nations. It is time to call it what it is. It is time to use our voices, to use our skill set, to be effective influencers for change. And you're an influencer, whether it's in your family dining room, on the high street, in your school, on the boardroom, and use that to bring about change.
Dr. Shola, what a tour de force. So educational, so informative, and I hope a wake-up call as well for lots of people who maybe were falling into a bit of complacency before they watched or listened to this. Now, everyone needs to do two things. They need to order This Is Why I Resist, and they need to read it, and then they need to act on it. And that's what's very important. That's why these books are important. They're not just a kind of lockdown's on and I don't have much else to do apart from work or family. I'm just going to put my feet up and have a little read of a book. Obviously, do that. Very enjoyable. It's a conversational book, but also educational, and do something, act on it. And that's what it's all about. So it was a huge, huge honor. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Owen. Thank you.
We're never going to succeed in radicalizing politics and doing what must be done on behalf of the many if we do not challenge the dominance of the establishment media with our own media. So support Owen Jones's team on Patreon.